here is my second compilation of ghostly tales I have written for my series, A Reliquary of Ghosts. I do hope you'll enjoy, like, and comment. The House of Eldred, written and read by Christopher Halton. The driveway to Cardwinder Mansion was a long and desolate path that wound through bleak northern moorland, climbing a hill and descending into a valley to reach a flat plateau below. In the distance stood the mansion, a gaunt Gothic visage, isolated and hostile to all who dared to cast their eyes upon its grey, weather-stained, wretched exterior. There was a darkness about it, as though Satan had hewn its stone-clad walls from the pit of hell. Yet here, in this wilderness of brooding grey skies, leafless trees, and the disconsolate caw of crows, stood this sole edifice to the mind of Sir William Eldred, a self-made man whose rise to wealth from poverty was a story painted in this ugly vista of nightmares. My name is Marcus Briggs. I am a successful writer and publisher who took a year-long lease on this 21-bedroom property. The appeal for me was that its driveway was 10 miles long across rugged terrain, ensuring that even the most determined callers would be easily dissuaded from coming there. The isolation of the mansion and its desolate surroundings all contributed to a sense of seclusion that I craved. Hopefully, this would give me time to focus on a novel I was writing and give me a break from the outside world. And so, despite my misgivings, I was determined to find the peace I sought in this desolate place. Arriving by a hired horse-drawn hansom cab, the driver, a weaselly-looking man of a dubious distinction named Morrison, charged me double to take me here from the nearest railway station, some 15 miles distant, as no others would venture near the place due to its reputation as a place of haunted evil. This reputation stemmed mainly from the story of Eldred, a man locals alleged had made a deal with the devil to attain wealth and power from a humble and very impoverished background. As I recall, his rise to prominence was quite meteoric. He had begun his life as a child labourer in a Yorkshire coal mine and eventually came to own it. In more respectable circles, his story was often framed as one of resilience and determination, showing an ability to overcome insurmountable odds. Despite being illiterate until he taught himself to read and write, he possessed an ability for making money and seized every opportunity to do so for his own personal advancement. These profits provided a platform to acquire many more coalfields, and his investment portfolio enabled him to buy gilt-edged bonds in many blue-chip companies of early Edwardian Britain. Of course, to achieve greatness, he walked over the lives of the many who shared his common background. His workers were poorly paid, and many died hauling coal from deep rickety shafts, where a wretched safety record led to many deaths but bigger rewards. This neither worried nor concerned his wealthy investors, and by offering them a premium dividend on their investments, he soon won a knighthood for his services to industry. Cardwinder Mansion was an epitaph for his achievements, and it was felt that the evil of his life was deeply imbued within its fabric. Although he died in mysterious circumstances some 10 years ago, locals believed Eldred was still very much in residence. Tales of his after-death presence were a lingering mystery that added to the mansion's evil allure. His cousins now owned the mansion, for he remained a spinster. They were legally obliged to maintain and staff the building by writ of a codicil in his will until a buyer could be found. As nobody had stepped forward to acquire this grim mausoleum, the family was happy to rent it to me at a much discounted rate to reduce their overheads. Now that I had finally arrived at the entrance, Morrison was insistingly keen to dispose of me and my luggage as the wintry afternoon soon drew into the veil of darkness. As I watched a wild, fearful-faced Morrison crack his whip and vanish into the distance, leaving me and 2 large trunk cases behind, a cold breeze blew in from across the moors as I struggled to pull the cases from the gravel drive to a large, imposing bronze door, which had a strange ornamentation of 2 dragons whose tails formed the doorframe on either side. Their heads were twisted at the top, meeting in the middle as they peered down at me with distaste for my presence. The mansion certainly exuded a palpable sense of dread, as if it were alive and watching my every move, and the air was thick with an unsettling pervasiveness. As I was about to announce my arrival on a huge, heavy brass-ringed door knocker, the door swung open with an almost grinding growl. I was presented by a thinning, grey-haired, middle-aged man, smartly dressed in a dark tail jacket, grey trousers, a tie to match, and a white wing-collared shirt. He bowed slightly and smiled, his polite demeanour contrasting the mansion's foreboding atmosphere. "Good afternoon, sir. You are expected." He then turned behind him and clicked his fingers, whereupon two young footmen quickly rushed out and carried my cases as I was escorted inside. Introducing himself as Stimpson, the butler, an imposing man with an imperious face that seemed guarded to secrecy, he closed the heavy door with a little effort. A hint of suspicion overshadowed his polite demeanour as he looked me over. I felt he was not entirely pleased with my arrival, but maintained his professional bearing, leaving me with a palpable sense of unease. "Well, sir, we are pleased to make your acquaintance, and I gather you will be our guest for the foreseeable future." "Yes," I replied, feeling relieved as I took off my hat and coat and passed them to the butler. Unlike the bleak and forbidding exterior, the hall's interior was surprisingly bright and airy, with white and black marble floor tiles and white painted walls. However, this brightness was starkly contrasted by a grim-faced hall portrait of an old man sat in a heavy oaken chair, set against a bleak-looking background of a mine pier with an entrance spewing out grimy-faced pit workers. Stimpson noticed my curiosity as he hung my clothing on a mahogany hall stand and remarked, "Oh, that's Sir William Eldred, sir, and painted a few years before his passing. He felt very connected to his mining interests and commissioned this portrait to reflect that." "What was he like? I mean to say, he appears quite severe there." Stimpson smiled. "It's best not to talk ill of the dead, sir." His smile seemed forced, and I could sense a hint of suspicion in his eyes. He interjected before I could press for more information. "Now, come along, sir. Dinner will be ready soon." He then escorted me up a beautiful white Carrara marble staircase, lined with gilt railings crowned with an ebony rail, which swept up to an upper carpeted corridor, lined with heavy-looking oak doors, framed within a white-walled corridor displaying a variety of mounted heads of stuffed lions, tigers, boars, and other such game that Stimpson told me were shot by Sir William on safari in years past. In some ways, these doors reminded me of condemned men's cells and the animals, an allegory of their victims. But despite this generated feeling of lost hope, the corridor was brightly lit, as was the rest of the house, with the electric lighting. Eldred had installed a water turbine generator on a nearby fast-flowing river that supplied all the needs required by the house. Stimpson stopped at a door which was to be my bedroom during my stay. Upon entering this ensuite bedroom, I was impressed with the lush furnishings and antique mahogany furniture. The carpets were a variety of beautiful Persian machard rugs, which gave colour and depth, and the bed was an old colonial American four-poster that Eldred had picked up in New England. He may not have been a charming man in life, but he had excellent tastes. This room felt very welcoming, with that sentiment underscored by a warming fire in the hearth. My earlier misgivings about the house dissipated slightly as I realized that Eldred had deliberately created a gaunt and hostile exterior to deter others from the hidden gems of its more pleasant interior, almost akin, I thought, to a beautiful pearl hidden inside an oyster shell. Of course, this observation was more influenced by emotion than fact. After ensuring the house staff put away my belongings neatly and tidily, I dressed for dinner. I then joined Stimpson downstairs as he escorted me to the dining room, a rather large, elegant, elongated room, with a well-polished mahogany table for 20 people. Of course, there was only one table setting, as the solitary guest, sat at the head of the table. The room was adorned by obviously acquired portraits of the great and good, with the largest being another painting in a gold gilt frame, depicting Eldred in a more arrogant pose, looking directly down upon the table, which was, for my satisfaction, displayed from behind my back, and not staring at me in front. Waiting upon me was a maid called Ellie, and Stimpson, who served a 3-course dinner with civility which I immensely enjoyed. The main course was roasted pheasant freshly shot on the estate by the gamekeeper, a man called Roberts. After eating dinner, I left after complimenting the chef to return to my room, where I relaxed over a glass of brandy before bed. Superficially, I felt very accommodated here, but inside me, my subconscious felt less enthusiastic. I later retired to bed and had a pleasant sleep, and the following morning Stimpson awoke me and served me breakfast. I asked Stimpson if there was a morning newspaper, and as he collected my tray, he smiled and said, "We have no such deliveries here, sir, of any newspaper, just the weekly delivery of mail and nothing else." As he left, he smiled and said, "After all, sir, you are here to enjoy isolation from the world. Would a newspaper not be contrary to those wishes? In his time, Sir William banned the press as, like you, he wanted perfect peace. I am sure you can appreciate this sentiment." He opened the door and turned to me. "If there is anything else, sir, please pull the servant cord by your bed, and someone will be attendant upon you." With the gentle swing of the door, he was gone. Having enjoyed a bath, I dressed for the day, after which the maid Ellie, who served me the previous night, came in to make my bed. She told me that she had worked at the house for some years, and was in fact the daughter of Roberts the gamekeeper, and lived with her family in a tied estate cottage nearby. A slim, attractive young woman in her mid-20s, with neatly tied auburn hair, she diligently performed her duties. However, she seemed as though something more prescient weighed upon her mind, and her polite responses harboured something within her that I couldn't quite put my finger upon. Her oddness and that of Stimpson I put down to living in the isolation of the surrounding moors and this weirdly built mansion, and so I put these impressions to one side. After completing her tasks, including cleaning the fireplace and changing the bed linen, she curtsied me and hurriedly left. My curiosity about this house was growing, and I felt compelled to spend the day exploring the property. I initially went to the kitchen, where I met the chef, Mrs. Roberts, Ellie's mother, and John Roberts' wife, the gamekeeper. She was a well-built lady in her mid-50s, wearing a large white apron. She was busy preparing lunch with the assistance of the 2 young footmen, her sons Albert and James, who were around 20 and 22. All were very much like Ellie in temperament, and although polite when questioned, they had that same seed of uncertainty about them. I asked Mrs. Roberts, "I am surprised this house has a cook, considering it has no owner to serve." She turned her head to me while dismembering a chicken for lunch and said, "Well, sir, I am, if you like, the house's caretaker, and I would normally only serve food for Mr. Stimpson and the family, so you being here adds another layer to my daily duties, and hopefully you will find the peace and tranquillity here much to your liking." She briefly paused while placing the chicken joints into a pan and said, after rubbing her hands on her apron, "You may have heard small talk from the locals about the house, which I can assure you is complete nonsense. People say that Sir William made a pact with the devil and that he is sometimes seen briefly and then disappears." She smiled and continued, "I think Sir William started some of these rumours to keep people away, and I must say it works other than your good self and the Weekly Post." I asked, "Did you know Sir William?" She lost her smile and replied, "He was a hard taskmaster, sir. You must excuse me now, as lunch will be ready in 2 hours." Again, no sooner had I touched on any talk involving Eldred than the staff here quickly changed the subject. I thanked Mrs. Roberts for her excellent cooking skills and left her and her sons. but I realised the more I spoke to the Roberts family or the butler, the more I was convinced that regarding Eldred there were more questions than answers that remained to be answered. The following day I decided to walk on the moors. It was a warm morning, and the normal greyness of the landscape had a certain vibrancy of a greenish-brown hue as the sun-cleansing light swept from behind a heavy cloak of dark clouds that drifted silently across the myriad of stone walls and stunted trees below. It was, to be said, a harsh, unforgiving prospect, with the occasional escarpments that dipped below the undulations of the hills, giving some shelter from the frequent and savage winds. In the distance I chanced upon an elderly man standing and staring at me and the house. I knew he was elderly by his hunched body, with one hand supporting his weight on a walking stick. He wore a deerstalker hat and a matching cloak, and he reminded me of old Eldred from the portraits in the house. But why was he there, just standing and staring? I decided to walk over to speak to him, but was shocked to suddenly feel a hand on my shoulder, which caused me to turn around sharply. Looking at me in the face was a man wearing a flat cap and a hacking jacket with breeches. He looked severe, with a thin moustache that underlined that sentiment. He introduced himself as John Roberts, the gamekeeper, and over his shoulder was a brace of tied pheasants and a double-barreled shotgun in his hand. His face was weather-worn, with deep creases which foretold a harsh life in the elements. I turned around from this distraction, but the old man was gone. Turning back to Roberts, I said, "Did you see him?" "Who, sir?" I responded more sharply, "The old man." Roberts replied, "Only you and me, sir, nobody else. I had been out this past hour shooting game for dinner, and other than yourself today, I never saw a living soul." I retorted, "But he was there wearing a deerstalker hat, cape and—" Roberts interrupted me and said, "A walking stick, sir." "Well, yes, indeed, so you did see him." Somewhat nervously, Roberts replied, "You have described Sir William Eldred, sir. He used to dress like that when on the moors. But you couldn't have seen him or anyone else, as he is dead, and you are the only guest in this isolated place." Seizing the opportunity to press further regarding Eldred, I asked Roberts, "Can I ask you some questions about Sir William?" Nervously he replied, "You may, sir, but I cannot say whether I have all the answers." "Well," I continued, "whenever I speak to your family or Stimpson the butler about this man, they appear unwilling to discuss him, almost fearful, I would say." He stood silent momentarily and replied, "Sir William left a strong imprint in that house, so strong that you become convinced he is watching your every move. I have seen him occasionally around the house, and I know my wife has too. He just suddenly appears and then disappears." "So," I said, "could I have just seen him on the moor?" He looked around cautiously and replied, "You may have done, sir, but I have never seen him outside, but I can say he looks as real as you and me." I then asked about his reported death, as all I could ascertain was that he died in mysterious circumstances. Having been pushed to reply, Roberts told me Sir William was on business in the Caribbean when he died. He was in Haiti to discuss a business venture when he collapsed dead in his hotel room. Apparently he was buried on the island with no memorial to him back home, although a death certificate was issued, which was accepted by the authorities. Thereafter the estate was passed into the hands of his cousins. I thanked Roberts and we parted company. I felt this required further information, and in the coming weeks I wrote several letters to both the Haitian Embassy and the Colonial Office in London, who both confirmed Eldred's death. However, the cause of death was never medically verified by an autopsy, with both authorities accepting that he died of a heart attack. This was also confirmed in a Times newspaper obituary for 1910, which added a crucial piece of information that Eldred was found dead by his butler Stimpson. I later caught up with Stimpson in the library, where I touched on Eldred's death. I was convinced that I had either seen Eldred as a ghost or that he was actually still alive. Stimpson was formerly polite and less engaging, and refused to be drawn on detail. He confirmed the business trip and Eldred's death, but could not add further detail other than the fact that he was buried in Le Grand Cimetière, Port-au-Prince. He later produced a photograph of the interment to confirm this. He then asked why, as a guest here, I would be so interested in his death. I shared my possible sighting of the old man on the moor without mentioning my meeting with Roberts. He looked at me quizzically and said, "How curious, sir. There have been reports of Sir William's ghost inside the house, but of course, as any intelligent mind would realise, this is nonsense stuff." He then left to attend to other duties in the house, but added that he was always available if I wanted further details. I became less convinced of Stimpson's explanation, which I suspected was too convenient. Having the date of Eldred's death, I acted on a hunch. I had a friend in London who worked for a major shipping company with many links within the trade to other companies in operation across the globe. I shared all relevant information with him by letter and asked if he could trace any shipments from Port-au-Prince to England over the period from Eldred's death. A few weeks passed when he wrote back to confirm that the French registered cargo ship SS Ange de la Mer carried a large crated consignment under Eldred's name to a small port on the Yorkshire coast, which arrived a few weeks after his death. The crate was then transported to Mr. Eustace Stimpson at Cardwinder Mansion, who signed and took receipt of it. The manifest claimed it contained personal effects and furniture upon which Stimpson had previously paid import duty. Why would Eldred have bought furniture if he was on a business trip? That made no sense. On the outside chance, it could have been antique French Empire furniture, but I saw no evidence of that in the house. Stimpson knew more than he admitted, and I resolved to find out more. I later caught up with Roberts, the gamekeeper out on the moors setting animal traps, and asked him about this. He replied, "Well, let me think. Yes, a huge crate was delivered which took all our efforts to move. I suggested to Stimpson that it might have been easier to unpack it outside, but he refused, so we carried the crate through a service entrance, which led to the cellar where it was left in storage. Stimpson had a key and locked the door after delivery. That's about it. He never discussed it again." I inquired, "Do you trust Stimpson?" "No," he answered. "There is something dark about that man." I thanked Roberts for his honesty, and he agreed to keep our conversations on these matters private. I returned to the house, mulling over all that Roberts had told me and my inquiries to date. Curiouser and curious still, I thought. What would Stimpson's motives be in this regard? I could not see how he would benefit other than the possibility he smuggled something illegally into the country and used Eldred's name to dissuade customs from looking too deeply. But I had to admit this was all speculation without a shred of proof. But without a doubt, Stimpson was up to no good. When I returned to the house, I searched the library for clues. After all, what better hiding place for a depository of documentation than a library? After an hour of pulling out each book to see whether anything was concealed within their pages, I came across a large manila envelope buried at the back of some books on mining. Carefully removing the sealed envelope, I concealed it inside my jacket and returned to my room. That evening, having earlier cancelled dinner, I elected to remain in my room with sandwiches, on the pretext of writing my novel, which was left by the wayside because of all that was happening in this house of mystery and intrigue. I carefully removed the envelope's contents and was surprised to see that it contained a blueprint of the house. Unbeknownst to me, hidden servant corridors in every room were clearly shown, with one in the library leading to the cellar. What luck, I thought. Now I can secretly enter without the knowledge of Stimpson, or indeed anyone else. I also thought Eldred was still alive and using these hidden corridors to appear and quickly disappear to avoid detection. But again, I had only suspicion and no evidence to support that. There were so many gaps in this story. Hopefully, the cellar can reveal its secrets and solve this mystery. Stimson was clearly up to something. And so, after Stimson had retired for the night and the Roberts family had returned to their cottage, I took my flashlight into the library. According to the plans, a secret lever was concealed on the left side of a bookcase, allowing it to swing open and provide access to a hidden area. Based on the diagram, the entrance was small, but I quickly located the lever disguised as a protruding screw. Pressing the head of the screw released a catch, and a section of the bookcase swung open. Luckily, an electric light switch on the inside illuminated a flight of stone steps leading down into a vast chamber marked as the cellar. As I flicked the switch on, the door closed behind me, and I stealthily descended the staircase into the basement. The brightly lit cellar revealed various boxes and discarded furniture stacked around the chamber, along with another opening that led into a small room or antechamber. It was here that I experienced the greatest shock, which almost made me revulse, though I knew I needed to remain quiet to avoid waking the butler 2 floors above. There was the body of Eldred, who stood propped against the wall like a lifeless doll. His eyes were open but opaque and blind, wide and staring into nothingness, while his body appeared stiff and erect. I felt for a pulse, but his flesh was cold and clammy, and I opined that this man was a corpse, yet he looked quite alive with no decay to his flesh. But how? I carefully retreated from the basement. As I reached the top of the stairs, I turned off the light switch which opened the secret door. I ensured that it was then firmly closed and retired to my bedroom. I could not sleep, no matter how I tried. I knew my room had a secret corridor, and I was deeply unnerved that somehow Stimson would discover my trespass and deal with me in the manner of Eldred. I also knew Ellie would be in at 8 a.m. to serve my breakfast. Sure enough, dawn came, and an hour later there was the daily tap on the door as Ellie came in to give me my food on a silver serving tray. I, of course, pretended to have been asleep, but Ellie noticed my bleary eyes and said concernedly, "Did you not sleep well, sir?" I replied, "Oh, I had a bad dream, Ellie, and could not sleep much, but I thank you for asking and request you tell the others not to disturb me until lunch, as I need to catch up with some sleep." She smiled, gave me a customary curtsy, and left after gently closing the door. After 3 hours of sleep, I realized that Eldred and Stimson had been to a country noted for reviving the dead into what is called zombies through the use of the black arts. There seemed a possibility based on Eldred's physical state that some devil-worshipping voodoo cult may have brought him back as the living dead, and that Stimson was controlling him for some nefarious purpose. But for what reason, I did not know. I decided to enlist John Roberts's help by showing him Eldred's body, which would convince him to help me stop Stimson's evil work. Later that day I found Roberts in the stable block area, and without going into the necessity of speech, I explained everything I had discovered. He thought my suggestion was preposterous, but agreed to accompany me to see for himself. He said he would bring his double-barreled 12-gauge shotgun for safety, as we would never know what would be likely laid in store on our arrival. At midnight we met surreptitiously in the library and entered the cellars together via the secret library staircase. When we got there, Eldred's body was still propped up in the antechamber, and as we both stood there looking at Eldred's body, we were unaware that footsteps had entered the room behind us, until we heard a slight cough. We both turned and saw a grinning Stimson, who said rather smugly, "What a detective you turned out to be, sir," he continued. "You have got all of this wrong. I am actually Eldred controlling Stimson's body." I retorted, "You are completely crazy, Stimson. Eldred's body is propped up against the wall." "Yes, that is my body, and I am now inhabiting Stimson's body. While we were in Haiti, I knew I had not long to live, and I made a pact with a satanic voodoo cult that allowed me to transfer my soul into my servant's body. And here I am, and soon you and Roberts will become the undead and work under my command. I can even control my own zombified body, which you saw on the moors, but for any prying eyes, both of you will die as a murderer and suicide with Roberts' shotgun." He then started to chant in French, saying, "J'ordonne esprit des morts d'exécuter mes ordres et de prendre la vie de ces hommes," and threw some small bones and animal blood from a file onto the floor. Robert suddenly became taut and his eyes widely fixated on his shotgun, which he desperately tried to resist from pointing at me. But he could not resist. Eldred's will was strong and too powerful. Before the weapon was turned entirely on me, I deflected in terror the barrel with my hands, and the gun unexpectedly fired into Eldred's body. With that, the body of Eldred started to burn, as the entire building above began to rumble and shake, as though this too was in its final death throes, causing masonry to come crashing down around us. Stimpson became frozen, and both his and Eldred's bodies were consumed by flames that emanated from their chests. By this time, Roberts had come to his senses, and we fled safely from the cellar and out into the grounds. At the same time, behind us, the evil edifice to Eldred's power started to collapse into a pile of rubble, which was swallowed up by a giant flaming cavernous cauldron that appeared in the ground around the house. The final remnants of the Cardwinder Mansion disappeared forever and were finally buried. It was though Satan himself had taken back everything that was once bestowed on the creature that was William Eldred. Some weeks later, authorities launched an official inquiry into the mansion's destruction. Engineers discovered that below the mansion, the ground was riddled with mining tunnels abandoned by Eldred many years earlier, and the inquiry agreed that the collapse of these workings caused the mansion to fall into them. The bodies of either man were never discovered, and officially only Stimpson was missing. Of course, nobody dared tell what had happened, and the inquiry was closed. I appreciated the irony of the occasion where Eldred destroyed his beloved mansion through his avarice, which forever buried him and his epitaph for eternity. And here a fitting end and the conclusion of my story. The end. The Devil of Darbury, written and read by Christopher Halton. Around 20 years ago I settled in Darbury, a village consisting of small but delightfully compact thatched stone cottages and much larger tiled Georgian townhouses, all nestling snugly against a verdant pastureland of hills and interspersed woodland neatly divided by the bubbling stream of the winding river Barnbrook. With a local dairy, a greengrocer, a hardware shop and a butcher, it was complemented by a small school and a family doctor. In many respects, it was a place where time had stood still, apart from the ghastly intrusion of the motor car, which infrequently arrived with sightseers putting all the horses and dogs to fright, and of course the hourly resonating peal of the tower clock at St. Michael's Church, which, according to locals, was added as a celebration of Nelson's victory over the French following the Battle of the Nile in 1798. As Henry James, the local solicitor and commissioner for oaths, my days were filled with legal matters concerning the local farmers and gentry. Yet my true passion lay in the village museum, a charming timber-frame coach house I had the honour of curating, a role that often led me to unexpected discoveries. My decision to settle in Darbury was deliberate. I wanted to escape the bustling pace of a London practice and enjoy a more serene existence. Despite my years of service and familiarity with the locals, I was often regarded as an outsider, a label that faded when my expertise was needed to resolve disputes, a service I offered freely. But to the point, and away from this painted scene, I recall a very odd and sad story that happened a few years ago. Nearby the village is the Sowerby estate, consisting of a large but rather turgid 16th century timber-framed house that received something of a makeover in the 18th century. A plastered brick front with a Georgian portico entrance was added to give it a more modern appearance, as was the day's fashion, and was punctuated with rows of dreary sash windows, which gave charmless austerity to its relatively plain appearance. The current owner was the local squire, Sir Trinian Montague, a rather brusque and often jovial character, but a genuinely decent individual who resembled a latter-day John Bull, being somewhat corpulent in physique with bushy sideburns and a large, round, pasty face decorated with bright red cheeks and a short but unruly mop of brown hair. He claimed he could drink anyone under the table when challenged, and enjoyed the company more of his workers than of his fellow landed gentry. Sir Trinian owned 10,000 acres of pasture, and with his herd of cows was the primary milk supplier in the district. He also owned the village dairy where the milk was processed, and gave donations regularly to the poor. As such, I rarely had any social contact with him, as most of my dealings were confined to legal matters. However, occasionally he dropped off some interesting Roman finds dug up on his land for display in the museum, or I went to his home to discuss legal work. But in all of these circumstances, contact with him was minimal. That changed on a cold and drab February afternoon in 1920, when I attended by pony and trap Sowerby Hall at the urgency of his request to discuss something he described as odd. He assured me this was not in a legal context, but regarding my knowledge as an antiquarian. Having arrived in a heavy rainstorm, a footman met me with an umbrella and escorted me into the hall. After removing my hat and raincoat and passing them to the footman, I joined him in the drawing room, which was heavily beamed and wainscoted and had a roaring fire in a Bessemer fireplace. After greeting me and shaking my hand, he welcomed me to sit in a winged armchair beside his, placed in front of the fire. Having been given a warming brandy, he sat down and said, "Don't know where to begin, old boy, but here goes." He sipped his brandy and continued. "Down in the cellar, I had a builder and his team demolish an old brick side wall which was collapsing and needing replacement. The builders propped up the floor beams above, as we all agreed it was a supporting wall, and that if it collapsed, it would take half the house into the cellar." He paused briefly and continued. "You can jolly well imagine my surprise when we discovered a void beyond instead of stone and dirt. They quickly cleared sufficient space to enter, and a workman with a lamp went in. Shortly after, a scream of terror followed, and the worker scurried out quickly and in a state of shock. Gaining my interest, I said, 'And what did your workmen find there?' Looking quite serious, he replied, 'A walled-up room with a stone sarcophagus bound by rusting chains, a sight that sent collective chills down our spines.'" He paused again and, with now trembling hands, poured another brandy, which I declined for myself. "And, sir?" Taking a gulp, he replied, "Well, the chains, although very old, were impossible to remove without help from the local smithy, who agreed to attend the following day in the company of the village doctor, who also, as you know, is the local coroner, as we suspected someone's body to be present. We all went down there in a group, safety in numbers, eh? But having arrived there, we were shocked to see the chains were removed and the stone lid on its side against the sarcophagus. It was empty, save for a parchment scroll written in ink with weird characters. He then handed me this delicate item, which was still quite legible. The unexpectedness of the discovery left us all in a state of disbelief. It was written in ancient runic characters, a language I knew little of. Having agreed to allow me to keep it for translation, we went to the cellar where, as described, the sarcophagus remained. Looking at it in more detail, I observed that it bore Roman characters carved into the side wall, which I translated from Latin, which read, "Lucretia oxor pontae maximi, animam eus in pars requirunt da," and in English as, "Lucretia, wife of Pontius Maximus, may the gods rest her soul in peace." "How very strange," I remarked. "A Roman coffin with a runic Norse parchment and unbound from chains with nothing within." I looked at a very worried Sir Trinian. I asked whether he had conducted any investigations to establish how this had arrived here, and more importantly, whether staff or other interlopers had entered this chamber to remove its contents. He replied, "Well, old bean, you did see I unlocked the cellar door to get in here, and it was still locked the morning it was opened, and I have the only bally key. Having satisfied myself that there were no obvious other secret entrances, we returned to our winged chairs in front of the fire, where Sir Trinian engaged his staff with searching the library for any material relating to the house. 3 double brandies later, Simpson the butler entered the room with a dusty leather-bound book. Although printed some 100 years earlier, it gave an account of the area's history by a noted antiquarian. He handed it to me and said, "I'm afraid, sir, that is all we have on the house." He then asked Sir Trinian, "Is there anything else you may need, sir?" By now, Trinian was somewhat, shall we say, well oiled with the brandy, and dismissed the butler with a slurring, dismissive mumble under his breath. At this point, I took the opportunity to leave. As agreed, I took the parchment and book back to my office to conduct research, and assured him I would return when my work was concluded. In the interim, he agreed to donate the sarcophagus to the museum, which was duly delivered and installed the following day by estate staff. My first port of call was to an old chum from my uni days at Oxford, to whom I posted a copy of the runic text. Wilfred Owens was an acknowledged expert on what one might describe as dead languages, and the runic script was a speciality. A real boffin of the old school, I knew this would be a breeze for him. While waiting for Wilfred's reply, I read the rather weighty tome I borrowed from Trinian. Written in 1810 by Alexander Springhall, it covered the entire history of Darbury from the late Roman era, the 3rd century AD, to the end of the 16th century. It was a very well-researched work and contained much detail that was until then unbeknown to me. For example, the village was originally a Roman settlement known as Darburia. It had its garrison of Romano-British soldiers nearby, who frequently fought incursions from marauding Saxon warriors, partly caused by the waning power of Rome, which was withdrawing legions from England to fight on the continent. During this turbulent period, the area maintained a Roman governor or administrator with a villa built within the garrison fort. During the 4th century, the then governor Pontius Maximus ruled the area so effectively that the numerically smaller garrison resoundingly defeated hordes of Saxons and Pictish warriors from Scotia. It was claimed that his wife Lucretia, a woman of noble birth, was an evil high cult priestess who derived great power from the sacrifice of prisoners captured in battle. Under normal circumstances, human sacrifice was antithetical to Roman beliefs. Still, as these warriors were regarded as little more than savages, their deaths towards the higher cause of strength and stability were, in their eyes, worthwhile, as the garrison was seemingly invincible against their foes, and in time their enemies avoided their domain. But, according to chroniclers, this was not to last. A garrison member was appalled by her brutality against friend and foe, and poisoned her wine with hemlock, and she died shortly afterwards. Her grieving husband interred her body in a stone sarcophagus, which was buried within a secret brick chamber below the garrison temple, which in present times became Sowerby Hall. Nothing more was recorded of the garrison, seemingly disappearing into the mist of history. Within a week he wrote back to me on the translation, which he identified as Norse in origin, dating from around the 9th century. It was a stanza from Havamal, a Norse poem which translated as thus: "I can so carve and colour the runes that the man walks and talks with me." In simpler terms, it was runic magic to raise the dead to the world of the living. For it to work, it required a special ritual using human sacrifice, with the blood of the dying sprinkled upon an array of runic stones bearing this text, and whosoever was brought to life would remain alive as the living dead and in perpetuity. Of course, as he agreed with my thoughts, this was pagan nonsense, but the fact that this text on vellum should survive inside a Roman sarcophagus was at least a little disconcerting and very puzzling. Afterwards, little was recorded on the site, which was rebuilt in the 14th century into an aisled medieval hall that developed over time into the present structure. However, the name Sowerby intrigued me. Many sites of recorded Nordic settlement ended with the letters BY in their name, and it was known that for some time Danes who invaded in the 8th century used the site as a base for further incursions inland. Certainly they would have used runes as part of their language, which may be why the runic text was found in the empty sarcophagus. My research answered many questions, but there is still no indication of why the sarcophagus was hidden or why Danes may have left the text inside, and perhaps more importantly, what was inside it and who opened it. I returned to see Trinian at Sowerby and gave him my findings and his book. He wanted to donate the runic script to the museum. Out of general interest, I said, "Has anything strange happened here following your discovery of the sarcophagus?" He looked at me, shocked by my question, and then answered, "No, there hasn't. Why do you ask?" "No reason in particular, although the sarcophagus opening was rather strange, do you think?" He recovered and smiled. "Oh, I understand, old boy. Everything here is jolly fine, but I do agree that was rather odd." For the next few weeks, nothing of any interest was reported, and the hall and village went on into spring, with early fine weather and the impending rebirth of summer. But oddly, there were reports of livestock disappearing in the district. As there was no trace, it was assumed not unreasonably that one of the locals was engaged in sheep and cattle stealing, and that set the village to rumour and wild assumptions of guilt. Yet nobody who came into the focus of wagging tongues was ever caught with the livestock of others. Even the local police were unable to come up with any solutions either. But all this was soon forgotten as summer came into view, and the village welcomed a new resident, Lady Margaretha van der Wald, a wealthy 40-year-old beauty with raven hair and dark, smouldering eyes. She had bought one of the larger Georgian houses in the village, which came with an impressive half-acre garden filled with fruit trees, and a sizable ovoid-shaped lily pond stocked with large carp and goldfish. I had yet to meet her personally, having seen her only once. A statuesque woman of good bearing, she apparently was Dutch, and having always been an Anglophile, she wanted somewhere quiet and frightfully English to live. Darbury had all these elements for which she strove. I was keen to meet her, but until builders and landscapers had done repairs and improvements, she remained in London at an apartment she owned. By July she had returned to Darbury and finally took up residence. As the local solicitor, I was obligated to call and introduce myself to her professionally and personally to make her acquaintance. Initially hesitant, as she seemed from all reports to be quite haughty, I was pleasantly surprised to discover she was quite the opposite. By arrangement, I met her one afternoon in the garden summer house she had built next to the pond. Having been invited for afternoon tea, we sat together on lattice-framed cushioned garden seats around an ornate white-painted metal table, where we both made relatively informal introductions. She was dressed in a beautiful floral-printed light dress and wore a stylish wide-brimmed summer hat, which was cocked at an angle on her head. She had a lovely dark and alluring face, so much so that she reminded me of a classic Greek or Roman beauty with a small but pert aquiline nose. Her hair was almost black, wavy and very long, so much so that it was tied back into a ponytail. With beautiful fulsome lips and a very accommodating smile, she was the image of female perfection, complemented by a perfume that wafted gently in a slight summer breeze. Yes, at first contact I was very much taken by her. After having sat for the brief formality of introduction, she said to me, "Well, Henry, how do you find life here, especially during the quieter winter months? I should imagine you have to keep yourself busy, no?" I, momentarily in awe of her soft, lilting voice, replied, "As a solicitor, there is always something to do, my lady. As an interest, I keep a small museum here for the benefit of the locals, which encourages me sometimes to research some of the artifacts passed to me. But overall, I am never bored, if that is what you are asking. And how about yourself?" She smiled again, whilst holding a beautiful gold-rimmed floral Minton teacup, and said, "Please never call me my lady. It is merely a title conferred on me by my marriage to Sir Humphrey van der Wald, who sadly passed away some months ago. He was unlike me, an Englishman with Dutch ancestry, who made my acquaintance shortly after the Great War when he was a military attaché in Amsterdam. I met him at a conference where I was a translator. It was, as you say, love at first sight, but sadly he was killed in a road accident in London, where we settled after marriage, which is part of the reason I am here. I commiserated at her loss, and she touched my hand and said almost pleadingly, "Please, Henry, I am over this sad period and look forward to making this village my permanent home. I like friends to call me Maggie, which is an English colloquialism, yes?" I blushed slightly at our acknowledged friendship and felt more relaxed in her company. She spoke a little about her past, but what intrigued me most was that she was of half-Italian ancestry, which explained much about her complexion. She was a gifted linguist who spoke apart from English and her native Dutch, Italian, French and German, and could also read Latin and ancient Greek academically. All in all, I was incredibly impressed and could not wait to make her acquaintance again. She agreed to meet me next week to accompany me to the museum. Although she still had some business in London, she assured me she would return soon. In early August, she again contacted me, and together on a hot, balmy afternoon, we walked to the museum. As the exhibits were displayed on 2 floors, we went first to the upper floor, which contained primarily medieval remnants collected and donated by the villagers. She was impressed with the collection for such a small village and commended me on my efforts to display that history clearly and informatively. But on our return downstairs, she quickly spotted the sarcophagus at the back and in a corner after looking at the Roman artifacts. With puzzlement and shock, she examined the inscribed text in detail and asked, "This fascinates me, Henry. Where did you get it?" Realizing that explaining the story and my investigation would take some time, she agreed to accompany me back to my home, a relatively small apartment above my office on the village high street. Having made her comfortable in my lounge, I fixed a cooling drink, and we both sat at the dining table, where I shared my research story. After 20 minutes of studying my notes, she listened to my story and cross-checked facts, before sitting quietly in contemplation for a minute or so, and saying, "I find it odd that the sarcophagus was found covered and chained, as if to suggest that someone wanted the occupant, of whom I suspect may well be Lucretia, to remain forever in there. Yet somehow the chains were broken, and the lid was removed with only a runic verse for raising the dead being inside from presumably the later Danes." She looked distantly in deep thought and said, "Why would the Danes leave that when clearly they must have wanted her chained and bound within?" She paused and then said, "I too have academic friends who have researched ancient cults and will make inquiries on your behalf. There must surely be something in an archaic legend that can give some light on this." We agreed to meet up again in 2 weeks, and I arranged with Trinian to visit the cellar that day with Maggie to see whether she could find some clue that may have been missed. He was very agreeable to that proposition, especially as the lady was a noted beauty. In the interim, Maggie wrote to her colleagues and gleaned some information from ancient Norse, which she brought to Sowerby Hall. After I introduced her to a very excited Trinian, we sat in the library to discuss her findings. After being served afternoon tea and sandwiches, Maggie opened a flap over her briefcase, removing several handwritten sheets of paper containing details of her research and input from colleagues. Shuffling the papers neatly into a stack, she handed them to us and said, "Here is the total of what I have gleaned. To save going into the minutiae of detail, I will paraphrase what I have learned so far, so we can discuss going forward with this." She then allowed us a few minutes to read responses from her contacts in academia and continued, "There is a legend of a local Anglo-Saxon princess named Liveva, who was captured by the Danes here at Sowerby. The Danish leader Athelwulf took her for his bride and built a settlement where both lived, entirely independent of other settlements in this part of Danish-occupied England known as Danelaw. Their power base gradually spread throughout this region, and Athelwulf declared himself king and Liveva as his queen. She became entirely tyrannical and was believed to possess magical powers as a priestess through an ancient pagan ritual where prisoners were slain for their blood. People gradually felt she was demonic, and the king held little power. Eventually, a group of warriors took matters in hand and attacked her in her shrine, which was described as being of ancient brick and built below the ground, where she was slain with a sword with her body placed inside an old stone sarcophagus upon which she had earlier performed her blood rituals. They then bound the sarcophagus in chains, as they believed she had the power to revive herself and seek revenge. As an added safeguard, protection runes were cut into the 4 brick walls to prevent her spirit from leaving. In short, it became her tomb. I believe Athelwulf placed the runic verse inside it before it was chained, but that, as she concluded, is pure conjecture. So what happened to the settlement, I asked. As the power that ruled had been taken away, it simply disappeared following Athelwulf's death in battle a few years later. Liviva and Lucretia were, I believe, the same people, and the sarcophagus used for blood ritual was central to her existence. Trinian sat there in a state of shock. "Are you saying my family home gave sanctuary to this demonic creature? You have no idea, my dear, of how that unnerves me," I interjected. "Well, let's check the cellar now to see whether any runic symbols are carved into the brickwork." Together with flashlights, we entered the cellar. Within minutes, we confirmed that runic symbols were carved into each wall, and the collapsed wall must have released this entity's spirit. But what puzzled us all was where it went. Trinian reported no unusual activity in the house or cellar, and nothing similar was found in the museum where the sarcophagus was kept. The mystery deepened. Apart from the odd sheep or cow seemingly disappearing as livestock, nothing untoward had occurred in the district. Yet none of us felt remotely complacent. At this point, I have to say that I was becoming somewhat suspect about the beautiful Maggie, with her cultured, experienced charm and looks that would convince me that she was of noble Roman birth. She arrived in the village not long after the discovery of the sarcophagus and around the time that animals were reported missing. And despite reading her convincing research, where on earth would such detail of long-lost lives still be recorded? But on the other hand, I hope she wasn't because I was becoming infatuated with her intellect and beauty, leaving me vulnerable. For the present, I decided not to share my suspicions with anyone. After all, if it wasn't Maggie, I could be playing into the hands of the real Lucretia, and that could be a tragic mistake with inevitable consequences. On the 22nd of September, a young woman employed by Maggie named Jemina Smith left her home in the village to report for work at the house where she was employed as a maid. Nothing was seen of her until 11 a.m. when another maid employed by Maggie was in the garden hanging out the washing when she reportedly suddenly screamed and ran back into the house, shouting for help in an apparent state of shock. Mrs. Besson, the cook, heard the commotion and found the maid sobbing hysterically in the hallway as she sat hunched on the floor and crying hysterically. Getting her to her feet, Mrs. Besson, a congenial lady in her 50s, hugged the girl's shoulders and said, "What's wrong, my dear?" The maid Alice, a residential housemaid in her 20s, spluttered, "Gee, minor, Mrs. Besson, oh my God, she be lying dead in them bushes in the garden." By now, Maggie had heard the commotion from her drawing room. With Mrs. Besson, they went into the garden, where Jemina's body lay only partly concealed by the undergrowth, and on examination, her skin was pallid and cold. I was at this point contacted by Maggie, who also sent a maid to bring the village doctor, who arrived around the same time as me. And sure enough, this poor girl lay quite dead in the garden. The doctor reported she had been dead for around 2 hours, and her body appeared drained of blood, although no marks on her body were found. Subsequently, the police attended from a neighbouring town, and they led an immediate investigation into her death. At the same time, her body was removed to a district hospital where a post-mortem was conducted. It came back that she had died from loss of blood, and that no trace of hemoglobin was found anywhere in her body. Yet there were no puncture marks or cuts to her flesh, and she was found dressed in her typical day wear as a maid, having commenced work at 6 a.m. There was no sign of a struggle, and her clothes were not stained with blood. The police, led by Detective Chief Inspector Byford, a stocky, well-built man with 20 years of service, were quite baffled as to how she had died. He had personally never worked on a case like this in all his years, and despite grueling questioning of staff, nothing suspicious was noted or discovered. The property as such had no direct access to the garden from the front, and the rear walls of solid brick at least 10 feet high had no rear access gate. Whoever or whatever committed this impossible crime was hiding in the garden or working in the house at the time of the crime. However, as confirmed by others, the only person with no alibi was Maggie, who claimed she was reading alone in her bedroom. I was sure she knew the answers, especially since her thorough search of the house and garden revealed no one else. However, one fact that seemingly escaped everyone's attention was that this crime fell over the autumnal equinox, which, as I knew, was a time of religious worship for some belief systems, whether good or bad. I also reasoned that if Maggie was somehow the culprit, why commit this heinous crime on her doorstep? That did not make any sense. Later that evening at 11 p.m, I heard the doorbell ring from downstairs while alone in bed. Begrudgingly putting on my dressing gown, I went down the staircase and opened the door. I was surprised to see that it was Mrs. Besson, the cook. "I am so sorry to trouble you, Mr. James, but can I confidentially speak with you?" "At this late hour, Mrs. Besson? Did your employer send you?" "Well, no, sir, she did not. And it is with her that I wish to speak to you about—" Intrigued, I invited her into my apartment and sat with her in the lounge. She explained to me that on the morning that the maid died, she saw her ladyship through a partially open door talking to her in the drawing room, which had French doors leading into the garden. They spoke in whispers, and shortly after she opened the French doors to allow her out into the garden. She paid no more attention and went to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. "What time would this be?" I asked. "Oh, about 6 a.m. when she arrived to clean the rooms downstairs." "And why did you not report this to the police?" I demanded. "Because nobody would accept my word over hers, and in any case, I could have lost my job over making accusations without evidence. I know you are a lawyer and am better prepared than me to follow up on this," I replied after thanking her. "Well, there is not much I can do with this, as you appreciate, so I am off to bed and will follow this up in the morning." "Well, sir, I thought you should also know I saw her not 10 minutes ago enter the museum. She has a key, you know. I saw her sneak out of the house and followed her." Annoyed, I said, "You could have told me this first, Mrs. Besson. We are wasting time standing here." I knew Maggie had a spare key to the museum I had given her, so I was now more inclined to believe Mrs. Besson, and what she told me confirmed my worst fears. Hurriedly donning an overcoat and hat, I accompanied Mrs. Besson to the museum, which was locked. I assumed she had secured the door upon entry to avoid raising any suspicion about her visit. I suspected she was there to see her sarcophagus, and figured this was the perfect opportunity to catch her engaged in some dubious activity. I instructed Mrs. Besson to remain quiet as I carefully unlocked the door, and we entered. I expected to see her as I turned on the light, but there was no sign of her presence. I turned to Mrs. Besson and said, "She has left. We are too late." To my surprise, Mrs. Besson smiled and replied, "You are quite wrong, sir. We have all the time in the world." With that, an unseen, invisible force hurled me across the room and into the side of the sarcophagus. At the same time, Mrs. Besson seemed to float towards me, barely off the ground. A weird incandescent light emanated from her body, causing it to diffuse slowly into a grey, misty ether, which swarmed around me, and at the same time, I felt as though I was becoming dehydrated, and then I felt the life force being sucked out of me. Just at that moment, I was about to give up and expire, for I knew I was dying. The museum entrance door opened, and I could see within the greyness of this mist the figure of Maggie, who spoke in Latin, "Exorcizamus te, omnis immunde spiritus, Omni satanica potestas. As she spoke, the mist began to dissipate, and I felt my life force restored as the mist coalesced into an impenetrable grey mass, which was absorbed by the stone sarcophagus. As the mass entered, she took the original runic parchment scroll and ignited it, then dropped it into the sarcophagus. Upon contact, everything was engulfed in a golden fire that reduced it to nothingness. All that once remained in Trinian's cellar was gone. She quickly came over to help me back onto my feet. "Henry," she said, "I have destroyed this evil and you are safe. It will never return as the sarcophagus was its lair." We then returned to her home, where she made me comfortable in a lounge chair with a stiff drink and immediately began explaining herself. "I came to this village after you wrote to a friend and colleague, Wilfred Owens. He alerted me to what had been found there, so I decided to move into the village under the pretext of wanting to live to identify and destroy this creature. I could not reveal my true intentions, for had I done so, this evil that was once Lucretia would have destroyed me first. I had suspicions about Mrs. Besson, who once lived like you and me. But this evil needed a body as a host, and the poor lady who was weak of will and spirit provided it. Sadly, nobody must know of this lady's passing, and of course, in all likelihood, her disappearance will make her a suspect who will never be found." "So you used me as a sacrificial goat to bait it?" "Yes, and I do apologize profoundly, but I can assure you that you were being watched at all times and were safe, despite your misgivings earlier in the museum. And I knew you were beginning to suspect me as the perpetrator. But everything had to be done this way because Lucretia was part of an ancient coven of nefarious evil entities that a 15th century German Catholic clergyman, Heinrich Kramer, identified and pledged to destroy." She then explained that Kramer was in fact the author of a book on demonology called the Malleus Maleficarum, first published in 1487, and followed the papal bull Summis Desiderantes, which Pope Innocent VIII published in 1484. However, Catholic clergy soon turned on him, and so adherents of his teachings formed a secret society that pledged to destroy this evil wherever and whenever it was found. She added with some relief, "I am the last of the line, just as Lucretia was." She embraced me warmly and said, "Dearest Henry, I want to continue living here, and better still, I want to spend my life with you." We both kissed and were married within a few months, and without the necessity of detail, our life is blissful. I never did find out what had happened to those missing animals, and Maggie presumed that the creature named Lucretia had consumed their flesh and blood entirely as energy. But like many things in this weird world, we will never know. The End. A Paradox of the Dead, written and read by Christopher Halton. When I first arrived in the quiet rural backwater of Stratton Regis, I was unprepared for the profound loneliness that would accompany me. The village, now no more than a rural hamlet, was a survivor of history and circumstance. It had grown quickly as a centre for the medieval wool trade, where weavers used its unique blend of fine quality wool to make the finest cloth and rugs for the discerning, rich and powerful. It soon established a wool merchants' guild, and the wealthy who benefited also generously donated for their ticket into immortality by contributing funds and resources towards the reconstruction of the Church of St. James, then a small wooden building that transformed into the Gothic masterpiece that has stood the test of time on the fringe of the village. As business grew, so did the village, and wealthy merchants built finely carved timber-framed houses walled with wattle, daub and brick for their homes and businesses. By the 17th century, wealth from the woolen trade had gone, and Stratton Regis fell into obscurity as people moved out, and some unwanted homes were taken down and sold for building materials. Another facet towards its demise was only one road leading in and out. In short, a dead end. The village, once a thriving hub of commerce, had now become a quiet, forgotten corner of the world, its past glory fading into the mists of time. I first arrived in July 1930, having been drawn by the appeal of those few preserved merchants' houses and the church. Little more than a street, the village enjoyed amazing views across a rolling countryside of forests, grazing meadows, and a large lake constructed as a folly for a wealthy landowner from a design by the 18th century landscaper Humphrey Repton. This now public facility is a beautiful amenity that the villagers and the odd visitors enjoy in this off-track bijou village. With a comfortable inheritance from a great aunt, I was immediately smitten by the village's serene charm. The thought of living in a bustling town never appealed to me, and the tranquil beauty of this place was enough to make me purchase the dilapidated former Guildhall despite the extensive renovations it required. The very best craftsmen were brought in to restore the structure, consisting of a gabled roof, large leaded glass mullioned windows, and the many decorative carvings on the exterior beams and brackets, making this a uniquely beautiful habitat. The interior layout was equally exquisite, with a large medieval hall and a high ceiling supported by exposed timber beams and trusses, and a grand medieval brick fireplace setting a historic ambience with a magnificent overview provided by a minstrel gallery. The floors, made of sturdy limestone flags, bore witness to the relentless footfall over the centuries, connecting the entire vista into one architectural beauty. A slightly later extension was added to the hall, allowing space to create 3 upper-floor bedrooms, a large kitchen, a bathroom, and enough room for a study and library. The rear garden consisted of a small stream and willow trees encompassed by a brick wall, to which I later added a new lawn and flowering borders. All in all, I was satisfied and felt grounded. By November of that year, I had finally moved into the hall after the last craftsman had left. Being much quieter now than in the summer, the village seemed to go into a winter hibernation state. Very few visitors travelled out here, and the 50-odd residents kept themselves to themselves, especially as I was viewed by and large as an interloper. However, the local pub and general store were grateful for my business, as money is money regardless of where it comes from. Living alone and unattached was only compensated by my surroundings, but living in a gilded cage soon became monotonous as I craved human company. As an aside, I did have a local housekeeper, Mrs. Simmons, who came in for an hour daily to dust and clean. Being a simple yet kindly lady in her early 60s, she provided little company, although she proved helpful with her local knowledge of the village. While polite, the villagers kept their distance. Their suspicion of me was evident in their cautious glances and hushed conversations whenever I passed by. Following Mrs. Simmons' suggestion, I decided to visit St. James's Church, a medieval architectural marvel that lived up to its reputation. As I admired the building, I couldn't help but wonder about the stories it held within its ancient walls. Externally, the bell tower was a magnificent edifice standing 130 feet tall. Like the church, it was built with grey Barnack limestone and stood with fierce pride like some old maid doting over her charges towards the village below. The church's exterior, with its richly decorated facade, was a testament to the wealth and power of the early wool merchants. The fine carvings of gargoyles and grotesques, and the augmented carvings of clerical figures were a sight to behold. Walking through an unusually late architectural oddity of an arched crenellated doorway, I was deeply impressed with the medieval craftsmanship, evidenced by ribbed vaults and flying buttresses. These created massive space as one was drawn skywards to appreciate the light airiness of the entire structure. From here, one could also appreciate the huge leaded windows of Flemish glass stamped with the armorial bearings of those who contributed to its construction and internally adorned with graves and monuments of the wool merchant families. As I admired the building, I was approached by an elderly man wearing a clerical collar, who introduced himself as the Reverend Lionel Williamson. He stood slightly haunched and was in his early 70s, with a medium build, wearing a grey drooping cardigan and baggy brown trousers. He wore thick-rimmed glasses and had a pleasant demeanour. He shook my hand and inquired, "Haven't seen you here before. Are you the chap who bought and restored the old Guildhall?" "Yes," I said, and told him how much I enjoyed living there. Being shorter in stature, he looked up at me with a wide, toothy grin and much exaggerated eyes caused by the thick lens of his glasses and said, "You should join one of our services here next Sunday, where it'll allow you to meet the locals. They can be quite insular, but at least it'll break the ice with some of them." He paused briefly to see my reaction and said, "So how about that?" I smiled and said, "Of course, Vicar. And, by the way, my name is Alec Hammond." He patted my left arm and said, "Capital, capital. Now please excuse me, Alec, as I have a few visits to make around the village. I look forward to seeing you at the 10 a.m. service." He walked away towards the vestry, waving from behind as he disappeared behind a curtain screen. As I left the church, I wandered around the churchyard with its well-tended lawns and ancient yew trees. I casually looked at the names of those interred upon headstones, which stood row upon row like broken teeth across the cemetery. Within this arrangement of funerary order, I spotted alone a magnificent grave monument shaped like a giant finial-pointed urn, decorated with garlands and swags of stone flowers from top to base. When I approached, I caught the smell of the most extraordinary perfume odour. Even now, as I record these events, I could not begin to describe it. It was heavenly, and yet at first I could not see anyone who may have worn it near where I stood. There was a soft, gentle breeze, and it was warm and sunny, so I assumed this combination brought it from afar. And so my attention again returned to this funereal-type urn to read any legend or named engraving upon it. And there it was in beautiful copperplate writing, "Here lieth the mortal remains of Eleanor Rhodes Dyson, who departed this world in the year of our Lord, 1820, aged 28. Requiesce in parture." One detail I omitted to mention was that the base of the stone urn was pinned over at each corner by thick metal stapling rods that followed the contours of the raised plinth where it stood. Further, it was surrounded by pointed iron fencing palisades that, although ornate, indicated that entry to the urn was forbidden. I thought this strange, but then I remembered the legend of Birkenhair and the army of body snatchers that, from the 18th to 19th centuries, historically removed freshly laid corpses for anatomical research. I assumed that was the case. Realizing the hour was heading towards lunch, I turned away to the stone-flagged path to head home. Just then, I very briefly caught what I assumed was a raven-haired lady walking into the shadow of a large clump of yew trees some 40 feet from where I stood. The exposure of my sighting was brief and scant, so I put this down to a hyperactive imagination and continued on my way. The following Sunday I arrived at St. James before 10 a.m., perhaps somewhat nervously, expecting to meet silenced hostility from the locals, but my misgivings turned out to be ill-founded, and perhaps begrudgingly some said hello as they filed past the vicar into the church as he greeted them individually. He appeared surprised to see me, and once everyone was seated, the service began. Before properly conducting the service, he introduced me to a congregation of around 40 people whose lives ranged from children to adults. Some applause was given, although others tended to shield away. I mused quietly to myself, we are all God's children, but I apparently am not if I am their new neighbour. While being introduced to the congregation, I again smelt the same perfume I noticed previously in the cemetery. As last time, it had no discernible source despite my discreet sniffs in the air. I also looked for any dark-haired women that would fit the albeit brief introduction I experienced in the churchyard. Again, nothing. I was perplexed. I felt I was being teased, but by whom and for what reason? I put all such thoughts to one side as I sat for the service, which was concluded in about an hour, and thankfully perhaps no long drawn-out monologues from the vicar. As the congregation got up and left the pews, I looked to see whether I could pick up that rich perfume again, but no such essence was detected in the air. After thanking the vicar for his service, I left alone and walked along the meandering church path to the Lich Gate to make my way home. As I passed through, and amid the chatter of sparrows in a neighbouring tree, I thought, and I say thought, that I heard a voice call my name. It was odd that the voice was seemingly on another plane, as its audio ambience differed from the real-life sounds around me. But at that time I put it down to my imagination and continued home without further incident. Nothing of note occurred for the next few days, and my life followed its usual pace as it did for most days. However, I eventually met one person, an amateur historian named James Bryce, of whom I had occasion to speak to when I was in the general store. He had heard that I had bought the old Guildhall and struck up an acquaintance with me, which resulted in me extending an invitation for him to visit my home to look at the renovation work I had carried out. He arrived at 2 p.m. the following day, just after Mrs. Simmons had left to return home. James was a man in his late 30s with a mop of dark brown hair that matched his full beard. He was dressed casually in an open shirt, heavy pullover and light-coloured trousers. He taught at a grammar school in Burford, where he now resided some 10 miles from here. He told me that he lived in the village as a child, where his father was the doctor, but he had since sadly passed away some 15 years ago. He mentioned he had previously been here to admire the outside restoration of the Guildhall, but all he saw were workmen present. It was pure chance that we met while at the store, and he was pleasantly pleased to see it fully restored. After a brief tour of the house, which he greatly enjoyed, we settled in the lounge over a glass of port and some cheese and pickles I had bought from the general store. Once settled, he excitedly said, "You have done remarkable work here. Your restorers have brought out the best in the old house." "Yes," I replied, "but you can thank my late great-aunt Matilda, who provided for it in her will." He then added, "I remember coming in here as a kid. It was old Mr. Tyler who lived here then. He used part of the building as a cobbler's shop, and the scent of leather and old oak made a remarkable odour. Oh, such memories." His mention of a smell prompted me to share my experiences at the church. He looked intrigued as I related my story, saying, "That grave, the one to Eleanor Rhodes Dyson. I am reminded of a book the predecessor doctor gave my father when he took over in 1890. It was a ledger of accounts with clients dating back to the early 1800s, and I do remember this name quite well. They were the wealthy landowners who built the lake we have today. My father told me that the parents died by the mid-1840s, some years after Eleanor's passing. I interjected, and I noticed that her grave was protected with iron spikes and railings, which I assumed was because of the fear of grave robbers. He said with a bemused smile, "I know, doesn't all of this sound crazy?" He agreed to find this ledger buried with other family items in the attic and contact me again in a few days. A short while later he left as it was, now turning towards dusk, and he didn't fancy driving back on the rough roads in these parts, which were constructed of compressed stone rubble, which was the fashion in the days before tarmac. The meeting and conversation with James were interesting, and I couldn't wait to see what the ledger revealed. Before turning into bed that night, I was surprised to hear someone tapping on the downstairs window glass, and shortly afterwards the front door. While in my nightclothes, I came downstairs and opened the door. Nobody was there, but that perfume smell permeated the air heavily around the door. With a flashlight, I went outside, and to be perfectly frank, I was terrified. As there was no street lighting, everything was in darkness, except for the lights coming from neighbouring properties. But despite checking around the hall, I saw no one apart from that smell of a heavy scent, which was now a sickly essence. I quickly returned to the hall. Something I felt was very unpleasant was in the air, making me feel quite uncomfortable and vulnerable. After ensuring every door and window was firmly locked, I went to my bedroom and slept an hour later, leaving my bedroom light on until dawn. Such was the discomfort I felt. After that night, nothing further happened, and I felt more comfortable again. My brain was reinterpreting this experience as a bad dream, but I knew this was real on a conscious level, and I was deeply concerned and apprehensive about the future. Fortunately, a few days later, I was again visited by James Bryce, who brought with him an ancient ledger that recorded accounts of past clients of the village doctor from the early to the mid-19th century. The ledger represented what doctors would now call a patient's medical record, with the only difference being that then this record included a financial account for fees paid by patients to the practice. He said enthusiastically, "Boy, have I some news for you." Once settled at my kitchen table, he opened the ledger. He explained briefly that by coincidence the Rhodes Dyson family lived at the old Guildhall and were, by all accounts, very wealthy, having acquired their fortune from their ancestors' dealings in the wool trade. James then went on to explain what he had discovered in relation to Eleanor Rhodes Dyson's demise. Having put on a pair of thin-rimmed round spectacles and having cleared his throat, he said, "According to the doctor's notes, Eleanor was suffering from a rare blood condition that she picked up from a tick bite while staying in Italy with her uncle in 1820. However, she became deathly pale and she was brought home immediately, where her condition quickly worsened and she died from what was recorded as consummation. She was buried a short time afterwards, and the family, as noted here, were deeply heartbroken and bereft of their loss." I said, "But that doesn't explain the security around her grave, which is just as odd." Closing the ledger and removing his spectacles, James added, "I think you'll need to speak to the vicar about that, Alec. He might have further information that would explain this." After chatting for an hour, James left after I promised I would update him on my meeting with the vicar. That night, just before turning into bed, I heard further taps on the downstairs window glass and a rap at the door. This time I turned the lights off in the lounge, pulled the curtain slightly open, and saw a beautiful dark-haired woman in her 20s, wearing a red cape with a hood standing near the door. She had a look of urgency on her face, and I briefly felt relieved that what I was seeing was a real person and not some hideous phantom from demonology. Confidently, I went to open the door, but just before pulling the door bolts and opening the latch, I chilled with terror when I again smelt that perfume. A female voice whispered, "Please let me in. I am cold." A heavier tap followed this, and the voice became more agitated and louder, saying, "Let me in. I need to come in." Then the whole door and frame shook as the voice screamed, "Damn you, sir, I have to come in." I recited Psalm 23 verse 4, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." I nervously shouted, "In the name of God, go!" Silence immediately returned, and the smell and the woman was gone. I was in a state of shock. I turned my back on the door, and my breathing was heavy as I slid down its surface to my knees. My head was briefly spinning, but I regained control and returned to my room. I left the outside door light and all the lights in the house on until dawn. I finally realized that this manifestation was once Eleanor Rhodes Dyson, and I was sure her spirit had returned from the grave to haunt me. This thought left me chilled and very vulnerable. Later in the morning I saw the vicar at the church and shared the entire story with him. He comforted me and asked me to follow him to Eleanor's grave. Once we arrived, he mentioned the palisaded fence and the iron spikes. Turning to me, he said, "I know she wasn't buried this way to keep out body snatchers, no, quite the contrary. Her family buried her this way to prevent her from leaving her grave. The story is that they believe she was bitten abroad by a vampire. He looked me directly into my face. He added, "According to what I was told by a local here many years ago, she was last seen in the 1840s emerging from her grave as a misty form by a verger who claimed that this mist turned into a beautiful woman wearing the hooded cape you saw. But frankly, I believe this all to be nonsense, especially as the verger was a man known to enjoy the odd tipple, and despite that, you claim you saw a hooded woman last night at your home. This could have been anyone. And what if she was a real woman in distress? You had left her outside, vulnerable and afraid." He stopped to look around and said, "And if this were claimed to be true, it would defy all the known rules of science. There is only one spirit, my son, and that is our Lord Saviour God." "Surely," I added, "that lends some credence to the story." He smiled. "I appreciate your earnest heart in these matters, but this is 1930, not 1840. We in the Anglican Church no longer believe in this nonsense. If it makes you feel safer, I will give you a flask of holy water should you feel disposed of for protection." I felt he was being unnecessarily cruel and harsh and giving me no spiritual comfort at all. I declined his offer and returned home. Nothing happened that night, and I enjoyed a peaceful sleep. The vicar's remarks had, however, utterly irritated me, and he, I thought, a man of God. But events took an unlikely turn when I discovered while shopping in the general store the next day that the vicar was found dead that morning in the churchyard, having died from a suspected heart attack. He had failed to return to his parish house, and his housekeeper had reported him missing much earlier in the morning. As a result, the verger had attended the church where he had discovered his body not far from the Rhodes Dyson grave monument. The local doctor from Burford, who attended the scene with an ambulance, had issued a death certificate as he was known to have had a serious heart condition, and his body gave every indication of a heart attack. According to what I was also told was that his face was stricken with terror, which could have been the result of this sudden attack. Or, as I thought, he may have met Eleanor, and their matters lay at rest. Nothing happened for 2 weeks. It was as though all I had experienced was a bad dream, and I started feeling much more relaxed. One night, while fast asleep, I was awoken by the voices of 3 people arguing from next door in the hall. Half dazed, I clambered out of bed and walked to the minstrel gallery overlooking the floor below in the hall. It looked much different than how I restored it, and now I saw that it had a great oak table set with benches and tapestries upon the walls. Seated were a middle-aged man and woman and a younger woman, who was in her 20s and who I recognized as Eleanor. The man, a well-built fellow with a bushy beard wearing a frock coat and a collarless shirt, was banging on the table and stood opposite Eleanor, seated at the table and crying. He demanded that she stop seeing a man called Henry, who he regarded as being of a lesser class than themselves, and the woman I assumed was Eleanor's mother, a large lady wearing a crinoline dress, pleaded with her to listen to her father. At that moment all the characters disappeared into a mist, and then another tableau appeared of Eleanor being ordered out of the house by her father, who was enraged and screaming at her. I saw her wearing the hooded red cape and understood from his anger that she would leave the country to stay with her uncle in Italy. She was beside herself with grief and pleaded to stay. A footman dressed in a Regency-style jacket and trousers carried her luggage outside. From the gallery window I saw an awaiting coach and impatient horses, and I also saw she was now being dragged on board by her father as she pleaded hysterically in tears to stay. Her father, a blunt, arrogant man, screamed, "You will only come home when you agree to stop seeing this man." With her luggage loaded, the coach departed. The next scene I bore privy to was her return home, which I again witnessed from the gallery. In this final tableau, which was rotating scenes, her almost pale and lifeless body was carried into the hall by 2 footmen in a wicker stretcher, where they placed her onto an improvised bed set up in that room. Then the imagery switched to a doctor surrounded by her family, feeling her pulse and then shaking his head dismissively before walking away. And the final scene of her weeping mother on her knees, holding her body as a local priest administered the last rites. This was the most moving scene of all, with her father standing in one corner of the hall with his head bent as in prayer, but he was crying. At this point I passed out. When I awoke in the morning I was actually in my nightwear in bed. I had a horrific headache as though I had been drinking, which I had not, and the memory of Eleanor's encounter with her family flooded back into my mind. Was it a dream? I could no longer be sure, but I felt her family had wronged her, and this time I intended to put matters straight by helping her if she called again. For the next few days nothing whatsoever happened as the day passed into night and then dawn again. However, I did pay a visit to her grave and rendered a personal homily after placing a bouquet of roses upon it. It was then that I smelt her perfume and knew she was there. The atmosphere felt warm and almost forgiving, and I returned to the hall feeling much better for that experience. And here is the last segment in this unhappy saga. 2 nights later, again late at night, I smelt perfume in the hall area. Again there was a tapping on the window glass and then on the door, and this time I was determined to see this through to completion. I heard her voice again, pleading to be let in, and I opened the door. As in life, I saw Eleanor's figure and face, wearing a red cape over a beautiful dress made of lightweight, delicate silk, which bore a soft pastel shade of pale blue. The bodice featured intricate embroidery and delicate lace detailing, which added a touch of elegance. She stood smiling at me, and her face was full of colour and the vigour of youth. I smiled back and beckoned her to enter, and her figure seemingly floated across the floor, where I now saw her parents and a young, fair-headed man waiting for her with open arms. As they embraced her, the figures melted into a mist and disappeared, leaving the lingering smell of that beautiful perfume. It was, I felt, now over. The historical wrongs of the past had been put to right, and she was finally reunited. But here one might deduce the story was over, but not quite so. I returned one more time to visit her grave and saw that the palisaded fence was much lower to no more than a foot in height, and the metal spikes were missing. Her name too was different. She was now Eleanor Johnson, and she died in 1900 and was buried with her husband Henry. Even stranger was that the formerly late Reverend Lionel Williamson was very much alive, and he told me that Eleanor was a kindly benefactor to the church and had bequeathed money from her will for its upkeep. I realized from this moment that all I had experienced had been wiped from the timeline of history and replaced with this version for which I was most happy to live, knowing that everything had finally been made good. And so I conclude, did I change time, or was this all a creation of my own imagination, and that I will now never know? The end. The Retreat, written and read by Christopher Halton. Having returned home from India, where I served a commission in the 1st Regiment of Bengal Lancers, I was still recovering from the effects of malaria, which I had contracted there. After 12 years in India, I eagerly anticipated the cooler English air and the promise of a tranquil life in Suffolk. Daily struggles were the constant flies, excessive heat, poor sanitation, and debilitated water quality. But the prospect of the peaceful English countryside, with its cooler air and serene landscapes, filled me with hope and a sense of relief for the future. My main interest in life was not just a passing fancy, but a long-cherished dream. The thought of owning a small farm with a few hundred acres, a place where I could settle down and start my own family at the age of 35, had been a constant source of inspiration and determination for me. I had dreamed and savoured it for several years, and with a small annuity from a late relative, I knew I could live reasonably comfortably. My ancestors, the Willards, were historically landowners and farmers, and I as a youth acquired great knowledge in such matters from my Uncle James, who sadly passed away some 5 years ago while I was serving abroad in the service of Her Majesty. This connection to the land was not just a passing interest, but a deeply ingrained part of me, shaping my aspirations and guiding my decisions. Sir Richard Thompson Smythe, a close friend of my youth, kindly allowed me to use a cottage on his estate. The cottage was some miles distant from the village of Clare in Suffolk, bordering the Stowers river banks. As he described it, it was an idyllic location, with a long, sloping garden fringed with weeping willows along the river edge. The mere thought of living in such a picturesque setting filled me with excitement and anticipation. Here he assured me that I could live in contemplative peace without a care for the world, and hopefully recover from the maladies of living previously in such a hostile climate. I graciously accepted his offer and arrived one morning in June 1889 by hansom cab from Clare railway station. Having tipped the driver after offloading my luggage, he tugged the brim of his hat and left. After he had gone, I stood silently and inhaled the clean-tasting air. How heavenly, I mused, as the day was warm and sunny, with no clouds in the sky. But that brief sojourn in time was swiftly broken by the arrival of a small gig. From it stepped a very self-important-looking man who walked over to me. Having outstretched his right hand, we both shook, and he said, "Are you James Willard, sir?" Having replied in the affirmative, he identified himself as the land agent from the estate, who had been sent at Sir Richard's behest to hand me the keys to the property. This punctilious character, wearing a grey bespoke three-piece suit, winged shirt and tie, and matching bowler hat, identified himself as John Masters, a diminutive fellow in his early 40s, afflicted with an unusual nervous tic that caused his left eye to twitch or blink a lot. Aside from the tic, his appearance was cold, framed with a relatively austere thin face, a short but perfectly trimmed moustache, and a sharp nose upon which a pair of round horn-rimmed glasses was perched. Unquestionably he knew of his tic, which may have explained his somewhat officiously polite demeanour. He said, "Sir Richard has instructed me to offer his most sincere apologies, as the usual housekeeper afforded for guests here has been taken ill, unfortunately. However, he is arranging for a relief housekeeper to arrive tomorrow morning. The house is in good order, having been left clean with sufficient food to tide you until she arrives." Having passed me the keys after finishing his speech, he grimaced an attempt at a smile and bade me goodbye. With that, he returned to the waiting gig and was gone. This man certainly didn't inspire a friendly welcome with any degree of hospitality. Still carrying my 2 cases, I dismissed any further thoughts of him as I opened a white picket gate and entered the property's front garden path. At this point, I had yet to see the house, as a neatly trimmed privet hedge sealed the front from public gaze. Behind it stood several ornamental trees and shrubs that prohibited viewing the actual house. Despite that, it was a pleasant enticement for me to discover what lay beyond this mantle of greenery, and the gentle curving gravel path that sinuously disappeared into the trees and shrubbery piqued my interest. Following this hidden trail, I soon saw the appearance of a fine 16th century mellow brick yeoman's cottage with white sash windows and stone window sills, organically framed with black wooden studwork. The front entrance had a delightfully tiled brick porch, whose open canopy revealed a fine late Georgian black-painted wooden door that felt warm and welcoming. The beauty of the cottage, with its charming details and inviting atmosphere, filled me with a sense of wonder and admiration. It was as if the cottage welcomed me with open arms, promising to be a place of peace and comfort after the tumultuous years in India. I could hardly contain my excitement as I approached the door, eager to step inside and make it my own. Everything about this house exuded warmth and the feeling of gentle contentment with itself. Having unpacked my cases in the master bedroom and placed my belongings in an armoire and matching chest of mahogany drawers, I relaxed briefly on a comfy but firm brass headboard bed. From there I could hear outside the gentle dalliances of nature, with chirping birds and, in the distance, the flow of the river Stour, which, as I had discovered later, had a small weir with cascading water. All in all, it was perfectly harmonized, and I could not wish for a better place to recuperate from the arduous climes of India. Having made lunch in the kitchen from a fresh loaf of bread in a white enamel bread bin, I sliced some cheese, which I partook with a glass of beer while seated in a garden seat, under the shade of a magnificent magnolia tree. Later that evening I relaxed in the front lounge, listening to Jenny Lind's dulcet tones on a 78 RPM record played on a wind-up gramophone. With its wainscoted walls and Bessemer fireplace, this room exuded all I loved and missed for many years of home. Seldom had I felt as comfortable in body and spirit as within this architectural jewel, and I was so thankful to my friend Richard that I raised a toast of a glass of brandy before retiring to bed. During the night I was aroused by what I dreamily thought was the sound of footsteps on the landing outside. I was sure someone was inside the house, but I had to remind myself that all downstairs windows and doors were bolted or locked. Lighting a candle, for there was no gas or electricity in the house, I, with some trepidation, opened the door and stepped on the landing. There was nobody there, yet the creaking sound of footsteps persisted, albeit briefly, and stopped altogether. I called out, for there was no reply, and I told this unseen intruder that I was armed and would shoot if whoever was there failed to step forward. Of course, nobody came. I then checked all the rooms, which included the downstairs lounge, rear sitting room, study and storeroom, but there was no sign of anyone else in the house. By now I felt more relaxed and assumed the sounds were mice or similar between the floorboards, and I returned to my room. After some effort, I soon fell asleep until the advent of dawn, which was heralded exuberantly by the chattering of excited birds in the morning mist. I bathed, dressed, and ate a hearty breakfast before stepping outside and exploring the length and breadth of this hallowed property. By now, the mist which had earlier crept up from the river was burned away by the brightness of a sunny day, and I sat in a contemplative mood by the river bank, watching the swirls of fish in the water, which I presumed were gathering for breadcrumbs. In that morning light, the weir displayed all the vibrancy of a rainbow as the sun reflected its bright rays into the falling comb of water. Sitting here for some minutes also attracted the curiosity of two beautiful swans who frolicked in the water and moved closer, as I suspected, for food and attention. Just then I heard a woman's voice faintly from the direction of the house. As I returned, I could hear with certainty that a female visitor was calling my name. I went through the house and opened the entrance door. A rather slim and attractive lady in her late 30s stood in a brown ankle-length skirt and a matching bodice with long sleeves adorned with lace. She had auburn hair tied neatly in a bun and flashing blue eyes that gave her an allure of vibrancy. She wasn't quite the woman I had expected, and I sensed an air of dignity and good bearing around her. Next to her and resting on the ground was a large leather portmanteau, which I discovered later had been brought to the door by a handsome cab driver who had departed in the minutes it took me to travel up the garden to answer the door. Smiling, she said with a good voice that suggested an educated background, "Are you the gentleman requiring my services?" I excitedly replied, "Why, yes, of course, my name is James, and you?" "Alice Biddle, sir, your new housekeeper." Struggling with her heavy bag, I invited her inside and carried it upstairs to the spare bedroom overlooking the rear garden. Placing it on the floor next to a dressing table, she breathed a sigh of relief, stretched her arms and smiled. "It's been a long journey getting here, sir, but I am very pleased to be here and to make your acquaintance. If you permit me an hour, I will get myself organized and will see you downstairs, sir." As I was leaving, I said, "I am quite informal. You may address me as James if I am permitted to call you Alice." Her face lit up and she said, "That will be perfectly fine with me, sir." She giggled in a soft feminine way, and continued, "Oh, sorry, James, thank you." After leaving her and feeling even more elated by Alice's presence, I went to the study to write a letter to Richard thanking him for her being here. That evening Alice prepared a salad with slices of smoked beef that she found in the kitchen's cool box. It was an excellent meal, and while eating, Alice reorganized the kitchen and examined the walk-in larder to check the availability of dried food in storage. She later reported that she would need to travel to a very local neighbouring farm owned by Sir Richard, where she could replenish the larder on his instruction. I was perfectly agreeable to that, and later that evening I invited her to sit with me in the lounge, which she readily accepted, where she chatted with me whilst knitting under the illumination of 2 oil lamps. "Tell me, Alice, you strike me as an educated woman, and I suspect you have a good family background." "Well," she said, relaxing in a large leather club chair, "I was privately educated at the Dulwich Girls' School, London. My father was a diplomat who spent many years abroad, so I stayed with an aunt during my formative years there. Why is a lady of quality such as yourself working as a housekeeper?" Her face briefly lost the radiance of her smile, and she appeared troubled by my question. But after a brief pause she replied, "I made a terrible choice in my youth and married a man who transpired to be a violent, drunken blackguard. I find it difficult to talk about this, but my family cut all contact with me, and I was forced to live in reduced circumstances. For some years after our divorce, I was constantly on the move to avoid him. He would not let me go." Suddenly her face brightened, and she concluded, "But that is all in the past, James, and I am happier and more settled in my life." She explained that her family were well-to-do devout Catholics, and despite her ex-husband's violence, divorce was considered to be a sin, and on that premise they disowned her. I felt terribly sad for her, but she assured me everything was now fine and that I should not concern myself. For the next few days, my friendship with Alice became closer and much more meaningful, and with her housekeeping, I felt very comfortably at home here. Some evenings we would sit by the riverbank discussing and enjoying each other's company. We both felt mutually attached, and I sensed that our friendship was evolving deeper and more meaningful. But for then, we kept it relatively professional. One day in July, on another bright sunny morning, I worked with Richard's employee, a farm labourer named Jennings, to tidy up the heavily shrubbed front garden and trim the hedge, while Jennings, a young, quiet man in his 20s, was using a hand scythe in the garden. I stood outside, trimming the hedge with a pair of shears. The road outside was generally very quiet regarding any form of traffic. I found it unusual to see a man in his late 30s standing opposite me in the shade of a horse-chestnut tree, staring at me with an apparent disdain for my presence. I saw immediately that one hand held the bowl of a smoking clay pipe in his mouth, while his attire consisted of a raggedy wide-brimmed black hat with a matching dark coat and trousers, and appeared heavily built like a labourer. His face was long, unshaven, and rough-looking like dark-tanned leather, and his eyes were piercing from within the dark brow of his hat. I smiled and said, "Good morning," but he remained motionless and unmoved while he continued to look at me with utter contempt, which I felt deserved a response. I then put down the shears as I turned my back towards him, but upon facing him again, I saw that he was gone. I wandered over to see whether he had secreted himself behind the large trunk of the chestnut tree, but he was nowhere to be seen. But one thing struck me as odd. The heavy stench of cheap tobacco and the stale smell of beer permeated the air in a very unpleasant manner. I paid no more of my time to this presence and continued with my labours, which were completed in 30 or so minutes. I reported my earlier encounter to Alice later, and she stopped immediately mixing dough in a ceramic basin and stood looking visibly shaken as I described this man. "What's wrong, Alice? Please, pray, tell me." She appeared confused and picked up a cloth to wipe her hands before attempting to leave the kitchen. I gently grabbed her arm and, pulling her towards me, I embraced her and whispered, "Alice, you know this man, don't you?" She held her head close to my chest and said, "You don't want to know." I replied, "Oh, but I do. Who is he, Alice?" She almost spat the words out. "That is my ex-husband, Jeremiah. He is the one who has followed me everywhere. He will not let me go." She burst into tears, and I removed a handkerchief from my pocket and gently wiped around her eyes. She then pulled away from me, and still bereft, she said, "If I stay, I will bring nothing but harm and shame upon you. He is evil and vindictive." In exasperation, I said, "How does he know where you go?" "He always knows, James. I thought he had died from cirrhosis of the liver 10 years ago, but apparently not, because he eventually catches up with me and forces me to flee, and now I must pack and leave." The thought of this remarkable woman leaving me filled me with sadness and dread, for I could not imagine my life without her. I eventually calmed her down and pleaded with her to stay. I decided that we were now entwined as two hearts, and that I would never allow her to leave. Reluctantly, and only because of her affection for me, did she agree to stay. From what she told me, her ex, a man named Jeremiah Brickstone, was reportedly found dead in a hovel apartment in London, having literally drunk himself to death. He never got over her, but regretted his bullying ways, which forced their separation and divorce, which was granted by a court sitting in London. He always swore their marriage was for good and bad, and she would remain his until death. But whose death, I pondered. When I saw him in broad daylight, he looked very much alive and must have secretly followed her to the house. I was convinced only that a confrontation with him would be the best remedy to rid him of our lives. I still retained my service revolver, which I resolved to use should he step inside the threshold. From that moment onwards, I increased the security around the property. I purchased some man-traps, which were perfectly legal to prevent burglars, and placed these accordingly on all exits inside the house. From that moment, I felt it was a question of waiting to see what Brickstone's next move would be, so I stayed up late each evening to ensure her safety in her room, by staying awake until 2 a.m. in mine. Over the prevailing weeks, the late hours certainly took their toll on me, but I waited patiently and often very tired for Mr. Brickstone's appearance. On the 28th of July, tiredness must have gotten the better of me, when I was suddenly roused from my sleep by the sudden snap of the man-trap placed by the kitchen door, followed by an accompanying animal scream. I rushed downstairs with my revolver cocked and ready to fire when I was shocked to see by moonlight a dead cat caught in the vicious teeth of the trap. This roused Alice from her sleep, and she joined me in the kitchen, where, despite my best efforts, she saw the horrific spectacle lying crushed dead. She screamed, "Oh my God, please, no!" I could see from the light of the lamp she brought with her a message daubed in blood on the kitchen wall, which read, "I will get you, Alice, for you belong to me." Apart from being deeply shocked, I was unquestionably confused. All the house remained secure, and the cat was a feral one that lived in the garden. There was no way for the cat or Brickstone to have entered the property without detection. For the rest of the night, Alice lay with me on my bed, holding me as tightly as she could, for fear of losing me while quietly sobbing until she eventually fell asleep. I remained awake, bleary-eyed until morning light, clutching my revolver. Later that day, I sent word to Sir Richard via a messenger from his nearby farm to accompany me at the house on a matter of the gravest urgency. Despite his issues with running a busy estate, I knew he would attend expectantly, and he arrived later in the afternoon, having ridden in by horse. Sir Richard, who was in his mid-30s, was dressed in a tweed Norfolk jacket, jodhpurs and riding boots. He was slimly built and clean-shaven. He was always a dashing fellow with a sense of bravado, and I knew I could entreat him to help with this situation. Upon seeing me, he placed down his riding whip, warmly embraced me, and said, "By Jove, my friend, so pleased to see you. The country air seems to have helped you a great deal, eh, what? And you have this lovely house and Alice's services to boot. So tell me, what could possibly be so grave?" With his permission, I brought Alice into the lounge, where he sat cradling a brandy I had given him. We all sat down, and Alice and I explained the situation to him. At first we were met with incredulity until we finally arrived at the bloody message, a cryptic note written in what appeared to be blood, and the dead cat, its lifeless body arranged in a grotesque manner. He was, quite bluntly, very shocked. "So tell me, dear James, how can I assist you? Whatever is going on here needs to be dealt with jolly well promptly. Where do you think the bounder is now, and how could he have got in?" I replied. "I have no answers at present other than to ask you to help me with 2 favours. "And that is," he replied quizzically, "I wonder if you can use your resources to discover what happened with this fellow Brickstone. Is he still alive? I know that the premise of a dead man haunting us seems so ridiculous to suggest, but we are desperate to confirm that either way, and whether you could supply at least one member of your staff to patrol the grounds for a few hours each night for at least a couple of weeks or so." He mused quietly for a few seconds and smiled. "Yes, I think I can arrange these for you. I will also get John Masters to check the records. I have a source in London who can follow this through, and from tonight I will get young Jenkins to patrol the grounds with a shotgun loaded with buckshot in case this fellow is caught tramping around the garden. I'll ensure he will be here for at least 2 weeks. I cannot say how long it will take to verify records, but be assured it will be done as diligently as possible." As he got up to leave, he said, "One obvious last thought. Have you considered informing the local constabulary in Clare?" I replied that I had, but given the evidence as presented thus, it is doubtful that they would believe us until we have found more credible proof. He agreed and left after thanking me for the brandy and a chance to meet up with a dear friend. That night, with the traps in place, a series of strategically positioned alarms that would sound if anyone trespassed, and Jenkins patrolling the grounds, we both relaxed and settled in our respective rooms for a night's sleep. Jenkins was tasked with remaining until 2 a.m., and in his vigil he was instructed to walk around the property's exterior with a lamp to put off any potential intruders. This seemed like a capital idea. If Brickstone were in the locality, that would be a deterrent. At least, so I thought. At 3 a.m. I was awoken by footsteps creeping around outside my bedroom door, and I felt my heart pump furiously, expecting what might be awaiting me. I carefully opened my bedroom door and saw the silhouette of a man reaching for the handle of Alice's door, which the figure proceeded to turn. I immediately challenged him and saw it was Brickstone, who turned around towards me to attack with both hands outstretched towards my throat. His face displayed a maniacal hatred of a man possessed with a terrible evil. I let loose with one bullet from my revolver, which passed through his chest. Instead of expecting to see his now slump body, he had disappeared completely. Alice came out immediately after I fired, with a look of abject terror on her face, but when she saw there was nothing other than a bullet in the water closet door, she turned confused towards me and said, "What has happened?" I explained the preceding moments to her, and she exclaimed, "How can this be? He must be a ghost, or you imagine this, James." I plainly did not, and Brickstone's disappearance added a new dimension of horror for someone or something that could not be seemingly stopped. At this point, I almost decided enough was enough, and Alice felt it better to flee again, but realized that running now wasn't an option, as he would inevitably find her or me again. Instead, I asked Richard to double up patrols, with both working until 3 a.m. One was to continue outside, and the other sat on the landing with a lamp from whom I would take over this vigilance until daybreak. Fortunately, Alice was much more stoic than usual and determined to see this through. We worked this shift pattern for 2 weeks, the man-traps were removed, and even the local vicar attended to bless the house, and for a while there was peace. But deep down, I felt a brooding menace pervading the house. As we headed into August, the estate manager, John Masters, called by the house. This time he seemed more pleasant and amenable, and had updates on Brickstone's whereabouts. Excitedly handing me some paperwork, he exclaimed that Brickstone wasn't dead, and was in fact a patient in a medical ward based inside a psychiatric hospital in North London. According to Mr. Masters, Brickstone had been admitted there following a mental breakdown caused primarily by alcoholic poisoning, which followed his divorce some 10 years past. Within days of admission, he collapsed into an alcoholic coma, a state of profound unconsciousness, and has been there in this vegetative state, a lifeless shell, ever since. I was quietly shocked and thanked Masters for his hard work. On leaving, he added that there were no recorded deaths of any Brickstones, which is fortunate as it is such a scarce name. His contact at the hospital promised to inform him if there was any change to his condition. With that, he doffed his hat and left. When I shared this with Alice, her reaction was one of disbelief. How could this be? I've seen him so many times, and he's been physically aggressive towards me. Her shock was evident, adding to the weight of the situation. I was lost for any possible logical explanation. His body is in London, and not Suffolk, and nobody there has reported a man walking out in a comatose state. It simply did not make for any rational explanation. However, I couldn't shake the memory of a sadhu holy man I had encountered in India who could project himself while in a spiritual trance. A coma, I deduced, is not a million miles from being in a trance, and so I believed that with the raging hate he possessed for his ex-wife, he may have used that energy to project a solid physical image to wherever he wanted. This may explain the incidents that have occurred both day and night. This chilled me as it hinted at a supernatural element in Brickstone's condition. I devised a plan should either of us confront this evil menace again. I surmised that in his subconscious state he enjoyed complete control of his unchallenged emotions and could craft them towards any task or action he wished. It was the inherent fear that he so far thrived upon from Alice and myself's reactions that allowed him to do whatever he wished. To this end, we would prepare ourselves for his next visit, which I hoped would not be too distant. We cancelled our home security, and we sat up patiently in the lounge until 3 a.m. each night to confront this menace on our terms. As the darkness of the night wore on, we waited with bated breath, our suspicions growing that Brickstone was aware of our intentions and had chosen to evade us. But then, like a spectre, he materialized before our eyes at 2 a.m. on a forsaken Sunday morning, his face twisted in a snarl of hatred, his outstretched hands reaching for me like skeletal fingers. I stood my ground, my voice ringing out in defiance. "You don't frighten us, you pitiful washed-up drunk. You're weak, and your physical form lies helpless, unable to harm us." The words struck him like a blow, and he recoiled, his eyes wide with shock, as if he had been caught red-handed in some nefarious scheme. "I'll kill you both," he bellowed. But Alice stood tall, her voice laced with contempt. "You're a coward, a bully who preyed on the weak. But now your body lies wasted, a shadow of its former self, and we're stronger than you'll ever be." I taunted him. "Don't you need a drink to bolster your courage, Jeremiah?" With a flourish, I hurled the brandy from my glass at him, watching as he began to fade, his form wavering like a flame in the wind. I emptied the decanter, spraying him with the amber liquid as he faded further, his presence weakening ever more. "Here's your drink, Jeremiah, but you can't indulge, can you? You're a figment of your imagination, a worthless wastrel that was never any good." Alice's voice cut through the air. "You no longer terrify me, you bully. Leave us be and rot alone, unwanted, in your own body." His scream was like a damned soul being drawn by some dark force that had come to claim him, and in an instant he vanished. We later discovered that at that precise moment Brickstone's comatose body had died suddenly, and a short while after he was removed without comment to the morgue, where later he was cremated with his ashes scattered into the hospital gardens. He was now banished forever into oblivion, and possibly a hell of his own creation. Our lives from this moment forward were united, and within months we married and settled down with our own farm and raised a family. All that we suffered from the cruel ego of Brickstone was a worthwhile sacrifice, and we remained together blissfully happy and for the rest of our days. Well, that's the last tale from my recent stories. If you have any ideas for future works that you would like me to explore, please leave your comments below. Thank you for your continued support. The end. The end.